The Common Sense of Econometrics. By Joseph Schumpeter. The aims of this journal, and of the society of which it is to be the organ, have been stated above by the editor with that brevity and precision which are characteristic of every statement of a sound case. What I have to add, by way of comment and amplification, will, I hope, confirm the impression that there is nothing startling or paradoxical about our venture, but that it grows naturally out of the present situation of our science. We do not wish to revive controversies about general questions of method, but simply to present and discuss the results of our work. We do not impose any credo scientific or otherwise, and we have no common credo beyond holding, first, that economics is a science, and secondly, that this science has one very important quantitative aspect. We are no sect. Nor are we a school. For all possible differences of opinion on individual problems, which can at all exist among economists, do, and I hope always will, exist among us. Like everything else, economic life may be looked at from a great, strictly speaking an infinite, number of standpoints. Only some of these belong to the realm of science, still fewer admit of, or require, the use of quantitative methods. Many non-quantitative aspects are, and always have been, more interesting to most minds. Fruitful work can be done on entirely non-quantitative lines. Much of what we want to know about economic phenomena can be discovered and stated without any technical, let alone mathematical, refinements upon ordinary modes of thought, and without elaborate treatment of statistical figures. Nothing is farther from our minds than any acrimonious belief in the exclusive excellence of mathematical methods, or any wish to belittle the work of historians, ethnologists, sociologists, and so on. We do not want to fight anyone, or, beyond dilettantism, anything. We want to serve as best as we can. Economics, the quantitative science. There is, however, one sense in which economics is the most quantitative, not only of social or moral sciences, but of all sciences, physics not excluded. For mass, velocity, current, and the like can undoubtedly be measured, but in order to do so we must always invent a distinct process of measurement. This must be done before we can deal with these phenomena numerically. Some of the most fundamental economic facts, on the contrary, already present themselves to our observation as quantities made numerical by life itself. They carry meaning only by virtue of their numerical character. There would be movement even if we were unable to turn it into measurable quantity, but there cannot be prices independent of the numerical expression of every one of them, and of definite numerical relations among all of them. Econometrics is nothing but the explicit recognition of this rather obvious fact, and the attempt to face the consequences of it. We might even go so far as to say that by virtue of it every economist is an econometrician whether he wants to be or not, provided he deals with this sector of our science and not, for example, with the history of organization of enterprise, the cultural aspects of economic life, economic motive, the philosophy of private property, and so on. It is easy to understand why explicit recognition of this fact should have been so difficult, and why it has taken so long to come about. Philosophers, who have at all times delighted in classifying sciences, have always felt uneasy about the precise place to be allocated to economics as a whole. As it was, they practically followed the empirical dividing line between natural and moral sciences, and classed economics with the latter. And there, of course, the quantitative aspect or sector of our science found but uncongenial ground. Another reason was that economic problems have most of the time been approached in a practical spirit, either indifferent or hostile to the claims of scientific habits of thought. No science thrives, however, in the atmosphere of direct practical aim, and even practical results are but the byproducts of disinterested work at the problem for the problem's sake. We should still be without most of the conveniences of modern life if physicists had been as eager for immediate application as most economists are and always have been. This accounts for the neglect of econometrics, as well as for the unsatisfactory state of our science in general. Nobody who craves for quick and short answers to burning questions of the day will care to entangle himself in difficulties which only patient labor can clear in the course of many years. Nevertheless, the quantitative character of the subject was bound to assert itself. It is one of the most striking facts about the history of our science, that most, and if we exclude historians, all of those men whom we are justified in calling great economists invariably display a remarkably mathematical turn of mind, even when they are entirely ignorant of anything beyond the quantitative technique at the command of a schoolboy. Quenet, Ricardo, Bohm-Bavrick, are instances in point. Nor is this all. If econometricians have any wish to imitate other people and to glory in heroic ancestry, they may with justice claim the great name of Sir William Petty as their own. The second part of the 17th century is full of vigorous ventures into the field of econometrics. One has but to point to Gregory King's statistical demand curve. It is a question of some interest how it was possible that such hopeful beginnings could have failed to inspire further work, and how their results could have been left to linger in the dusk, although they were by no means forgotten, the reference to King's rule being part of the stock in trade of almost every stale textbook written ever since. In the sphere of monetary phenomena and its neighborhood, quantitative and even numerical analysis became established practice as far back as the 16th century, mainly in Italy, and this tradition was never lost again. Passages in the Italian writers of the 18th century, such as Beccaria, Carli, Very, and others, sounding very familiar to the modern ear. What we have before us there is nothing less than a conscious attempt to weld into one indivisible argument theorems and statistical facts. And, provided we leave out the word conscious, we find substantially the same tendency in whatever piece of the work of our predecessors we choose to look at. To give but one example, we are accustomed to scoff at the literature of the time-honored controversy on value. But what else is at the bottom of it? Overlaid, it is true, by heavy masses of speculative verbiage, if not the truly scientific search for an economic unit of measurement, or of several such units adapted to different classes of phenomena. There was no more unempiric speculation about it than there is about every science in its infancy. Nor is there less connection with such statistical materials as each epoch could command than we are entitled to expect, as everyone will admit who has taken the trouble of perusing Ricardo's reply to Bosanquet. Later developments. Essentially quantitative analysis, but crippled by the lack both of appropriate technique and of adequate statistical material. This is the diagnosis we arrive at when we study the work of economists up to that time, when Mill's principles were fairly representative of what our science had to give. This, too, is the element of truth which emerges from the hostile phraseology which we are in the habit of using about classical doctrine. Obviously, therefore, what our society stands for is anything but an innovation. It is no more than a conscious endeavor to remove obstructions to the flow of a stream which has been running ever since men began to think and write about economic life. In order to see in their full significance the conditions which have made it desirable, and indeed necessary, to form, under the banner of econometrics, a coalition of the different types of economists who are to join hands in our society, we must, however, now glance at later developments. The phase that could, until about 10 years ago, be called the modern phase of economics, admits of description in terms of three facts and their consequences. First, the rapid growth of our wealth of statistical and other material. Second, the progress of statistical technique at our command, which so far as it grew up largely outside our own field and without reference to our needs, was a stroke of good fortune, very much as a lift in another man's car is to the wanderer on a dusty road. And third, the emergence of a theoretical engine very much superior to the old one. True, on none of these heads are we, or can we ever be, satisfied. On every one of them, it seems to me, the real thing is still to come, and present performance calls for apology rather than congratulation. Yet it would not only be ungenerous, but positively false, to deny the importance of what has been achieved, or the possibilities which begin to loom in the future. In all this the econometric line stands out clearly. It was definitively established that economic theory involves quantity, and therefore requires the only language or method available to deal with quantitative argument as soon as it outstrips its most primitive stage. To W. St. Jevons belongs the honor of having spoken one of those simple messages, which at times seem to focus both past and future history and to become milestones visible ever after. It was he who said in the introduction to his theory of political economy, 1st ed. 1871, "It is clear that economics, if it is to be a science at all, must be a mathematical one." But still higher tribute is due to a Cournot who, without encouragement or lead, in what was then a most uncongenial environment, in 1838 fully anticipated the econometric program by his recherches, one of the most striking achievements of true genius, to which we pay respect to this day by nearly always starting out from them. Of course, it would be superfluous to emphasize the paramount importance of that great teacher of ours whose exposition of exact theory sprang from his head as did Minerva from the head of Jove. What I want to stress is that he constructed his analytic apparatus with a clear perception of the ultimate econometric goal, every part of it being thought out so as to fit it to grip statistical fact when the time should come. In this he went much farther than Jevons. This reads like a paradox because Jevons actually worked on figures, as in the matter of index numbers. But within the precincts of pure theory itself, he seems much less concerned with that goal than Cournot, and it is much more difficult for the numerical horse to jump Jevons' fences than it is to trot on Cournot's road. In our pantheon, J. H. von Thilmann's place is side by side with Cournot's. It is not only, indeed not even primarily, the idea of marginal productivity which it is important to mention here, but Thuyunen's peculiar relation to a set of facts, which is as vital to econometrics as statistics in the narrow sense of the word. Thuyunen pointed out that cost accounting, bookkeeping, and neighboring headings cover a mass of material which economists have entirely neglected. This neglect has indeed been so complete that the specialists of business administration now actually have begun to build their own theoretical houses which wall them off from general theory as completely as it, in turn, had excluded them, in spite of the fact that both groups of workers to a great extent a signal instance is the matter of cost curves till the same ground. It is clear that economists cannot indefinitely do without that vast reservoir of fact, nor cost accountants, bookkeepers, and so on, do without the economist's contribution. And, looking back, we see now that as early as 1826, Thuyunen's book could have taught us how theory grows out of the observation of business practice. I for one shall always look up to Leon Walras as the greatest of all economists. In his theory of equilibrium he gave a powerful basis to all our work. It is true that while he made the decisive step in the quantitative, he failed to move in the numerical line, the junction of which is characteristic of econometrics. But we have been taught of late to look more hopefully even on the numerical possibilities of that most general and most abstract part of our science which is equilibrium theory in Walras' sense. And this fact similarly indicates the econometric claims of the work of Auspitz and Lieben, of Knut Wicksell, of Francis Edgeworth, and of Walras' great successor in Lausanne, Vilfredo Pareto. In a somewhat different sense, we may finally claim as our own that greatest of all teachers of economics, Alfred Marshall. With some of us, it has become accustomed to speak of him as the exponent of neoclassical doctrine. This is not the place to show how it came to pass, not without some fault of Marshall himself, that so utterly unjust, and in fact meaningless, a label was affixed to his name. But I wish to emphasize first, that nobody can peruse his address on the old generation of economists and the new without discovering, though not perhaps without some surprise, how clearly our program stood before his mind. Nor is it possible for anyone who knows how to read his principles in the light of his industry and trade to define what he really strove to accomplish in any but econometric terms. Most important of all, he always worked with an eye to statistical application, and he was at his best as a theorist when constructing those handy tools, like elasticity, quasi-rent, external and internal economies, and so on, which are so many bridges between the island of pure theory and the terra firma of business practice and business statistics. I do not wish to speak of any living economists. but the readers would probably not forgive me if I failed to make two exceptions, and to mention the pioneer work of Irving Fisher and Henry L. Moore. The present state. All these achievements were, to say the least, enough as a good start and to build up from. And, indeed, work full of promise has been done in our line during the last 2 decades, work which makes us feel, when we now look at the Walrasian system, very much as we feel when beholding the model of a motor car constructed 40 years ago. But still, most of us undoubtedly do agree in finding the present state of our science disappointing, not only in comparison with the achievements of other sciences, but also in comparison with what our science could fairly be expected to perform. There are many reasons for this, but some of them only, having special bearing on the mission of this society, call for attention here. Reasoning on economic facts means, and always meant, within a very important sector, quantitative reasoning. And there is no logical breach between quantitative reasoning of an elementary character, and quantitative reasoning of the kind involving the use of higher mathematics. But nothing makes a greater practical breach in the evolution of a science than the introduction of a habit of thought which has so far been foreign to the recognized equipment of the specialist, and which at the same time is inaccessible except by strenuous effort. When the necessity of proceeding to the use of more refined mathematical methods, both in economic theory and in statistics, became apparent to some, the majority even of those economists who did work the quantitative sector refused to follow. At first they laughed. They do so no longer. Integrals cease by and by to be as hieroglyphs to them. Many of them try to understand and have made their peace with us, while reserving their right to criticize our results and to object to mathematical excesses. But this is not the full cooperation we need. Even in this improved situation, economics lacks that broad expanse of professional common ground which, in the case of physics, transmits acquired results to the general public. Beginners are bewildered by this unsettled situation. Energy is being wasted and the real business of the science hampered. Recent progress, and still more than actual progress-wide possibilities of it, has drawn to our field a most promising host of newcomers. But the old situation being fundamentally changed, we had no uniform training to offer them. Hence the lack of coordination of the work. The new men came to face our problems from very different angles and with very different acquirements, full of impatience to clear the ground and to build entirely anew. The man whom nature had molded to delight in unadulterated fact, whether he worked in a statistical bureau or did field work on his own, often knew little and cared less for that engine of analysis, which we call economic theory, or for refined statistical technique. On the other hand, the master of this technique, feeling its power and seeing the material to grip with it, tried to rush at his own kind of regularities or generalizations. And the theorist, conscious of his own task, refused more often than was wise to accept the work of the other two types as anything but possible verifications of his theorems. But, although uncoordinated, the growth has been tropical. It might be expected to settle down and bear fruit in time, but there is chaos for the present, in which only a very experienced eye can see an underlying tendency working its way slowly though powerfully towards a goal common to all. The program. The common sense of the program of our society centers in the question, can we not do better than this? Surely it would not be a reasonable policy to sit down and wait till, in the end, things find their level by themselves, and meanwhile to allow econometric eons of all countries to fight single-handed their uphill battle. What we want to create is, first, a forum for econometric endeavor of all kinds wide enough to give ample scope to all possible views about our problems, yet not wide enough to be hampered by the weight of an audience which keeps discussion in the anterooms of the real points at issue, and forces every speaker or writer to go every time over the same preliminaries. On this forum, which we think of as international, we want secondly to create a spirit and a habit of cooperation among men of different types of mind by means of discussions of concrete problems of a quantitative and, as far as may be, numerical character. The individual problems themselves are, as it were, to teach us how they want to be handled. We want to learn how to help each other, and to understand why, and precisely where, we ourselves, theorists, statisticians, collectors of facts, or our neighbors, do somehow not quite get to where we want to be. No general discussion on principles of scientific method can teach us that. We have had enough of it. We know it leads nowhere, and only leaves the parties to the contest where they were before, still more exasperated perhaps by those gentle rudenesses it is customary to administer to each other on such occasions. No general arguments of this kind ever carry conviction to the man who means real work. But, confronted with clear-cut questions, most of us will, we hope, be found to be ready to accept the only competent judgment on, and the only relevant criterion of, scientific method, that is the judgment or criterion of the result. There is high remedial virtue in quantitative argument and exact proof. That part of our differences, no matter whether great or small, which is due to mutual misunderstanding, will vanish automatically as soon as we show each other, in detail and in practice, how our tools work and where they need to be improved. And metaphysical acerbity and sweeping verdicts will vanish with it. Theoretic and factual research will of themselves find their right proportions, and we may not unreasonably expect to agree in the end on the right kind of theory and the right kind of fact and the methods of treating them, not postulating anything about them by program, but evolving them, let us hope, by positive achievement. We should not indulge in high hopes of producing rapidly results of immediate use to economic policy or business practice. Our aims are first and last scientific. We do not stress the numerical aspect just because we think that it leads right up to the core of the burning questions of the day, but rather because we expect, from constant endeavor to cope with the difficulties of numerical work, a wholesome discipline, the suggestion of new points of view, and helps in building up the economic theory of the future. But we believe, of course, that indirectly the quantitative approach will be of great practical consequence. The only way to a position in which our science might give positive advice on a large scale to politicians and businessmen, leads through quantitative work. For as long as we are unable to put our arguments into figures, the voice of our science, although occasionally it may help to dispel gross errors, will never be heard by practical men. They are, by instinct, econometricians all of them, in their distrust of anything not amenable to exact proof. The end.